Finally have a chance to demo this project I've been working on for a little bit called FilePile. What FilePile does is it allows you to sort of store code that you've been copying and pasting into your projects. Instead of having to pick through old projects you've been working on, you can put them on GitHub or just link them into FilePile, and then anytime you need to use those files, you can just simply run an artisan command and that'll pull in those files. So let's check it out. So real quick, I'm just using Laravel Homeboy to spin up a new project. So then once that's complete, I have a brand new Laravel project at this URL, and we're ready to go. But the first thing I'll have to do is install the FilePile integration package. And all that does is connect your project with your FilePile account. So over here I'm in my Homestead box, and I'm seeded into my demo projects folder. And I'm just going to quickly run the Composer command so I can install that package. The last thing I'll need to do is make sure that I have an API key in FilePile so that I can use that and put that in my environment so that it knows what account it's working with. I'm going to go to my FilePile account. Currently I have no pile set up, and a pile is just simply a link to some sort of repository, either Gist or GitHub. So let me go to my account and grab my API token. I'm just going to go ahead and copy that. Now, if I open up my .environment file, I can just simply put my FilePile key as that key that I just copied over. So now to test this out, what I want to do is run the PHP artisan FilePile list command, and that's going to list out any piles that I would have set up, and each pile is going to have its own command that I can run. So you can see right now it tells me no commands available, so let's go ahead and set one up. So if I move over to my piles, I can create a new one, and for the pile name, this would probably more so match your Gist or your GitHub repository. So you can see I have a sample Gist here, and all this is just a couple files that would be common login tests or authentication tests. There's one for password email, for resetting your password. Pretty basic stuff, but something that you would probably copy into each project as you set one up. The nice thing about this, when we copy it over, all of the files aren't boilerplate that someone else had written and you kind of have to modify. This is all code that you yourself have built. That gives you the benefit of working direct with your own code, whether it be you're copying over traits, tests, or some sort of CRUD system that you've built. Everything's yours. You're not trying to modify or expand on something that someone else has built. So all I want to do is run a command that's going to copy all of these files into my project, but not just the root. I want to make sure it goes into the test folder, specifically something like test, features, auth, something like that. So jumping back over to the FilePile, and I'll just call this authentication tests. And now the slug is what command do I want to run when I call this, when I copy these files over. So I'll just call it something like auth tests. Default install path is what folder do you want these files to be copied in. So in this case, I want this to be copied into probably something like tests, test feature, auth. There we go. So lastly, we have this field to post install message, and all this is a way to notify you of maybe next steps. So in this case, we probably don't really have anything. But in the cases where you're copying over files and then you want to tell yourself, hey, make sure you edit this file, make sure you include these files somehow, you have a chance to put this message here. So we could leave this blank, but I'm just going to put, we'll just say installed, smiley face. So let's create the pile. So you can see we have two sections here after we save this. We have a prompts section, and a prompt is a way to ask a question and then use whatever your response is to find and replace content in your files before it's actually copied over. And this gives us a very easy way to create more complex tools. But we can skip that for now. So instead, the only thing I need to do is add my file repository. And I'll go ahead and click add, copy that in, save, and I should be good to go. So let's go ahead and test that out. So the first thing I want to check is now if I run php artisan FilePile list, I should be given my auth tests command. So now running FilePile install auth tests will bring those files over. So let's give that a shot. So I want to say php artisan FilePile install auth-tests. I hit enter, and then it's just confirming where I want to store those tests. So we set the default to be test feature auth, but you can see that I could change that upon every installation, which makes this much, much easier to work with. In this case, the default's fine. I'll just hit enter, and then it's going to tell me what files it's about to add to my project. So it's important that when you're working on this, all of your changes to your project are added and committed first. Then you can bring these files in and then make a new commit based on just these changes. And then that way you can make sure that FilePile is working as you would expect, and all of your files that you set to copy over had work fine, and if you need to revert, it's easy enough to do that with Git. So this looks good to me. It's going to copy those files where I would expect. I'm going to hit yes, and then it tells me I'm installed. And you can see actually this is the success message that we posted earlier. FilePile doesn't overwrite files, so if I were to run this again with the exact same directory and hit yes, it's going to tell me those files exist, and it's not going to install it. What I should see is if I open up my demo project folder, you can see if I go to tests, feature, I have an auth folder now, and I have each one of my tests here. And there's nothing special in those tests. It's just something fairly basic, but the idea now is I can update that gist, anytime I get a new idea, a new test that I think should be part of this, and FilePile is going to bring those into new projects. So then the next item we might want to try out is, okay, how do I do something a little more advanced? How do I use those prompts to my advantage? And what I made in GitHub now is just a very simple starter of a CRUD demo. You can see I have two things here. I have a controller, and the controller is in the app folder, HTTP folder, controllers, and then I have this key here that I'm going to be replacing. What I want FilePile to do is anytime I specify the text underscore class name underscore, that's going to allow me to replace that text with something that I specify every time I run an install. So you can see that's here. That's in the actual controller name. So if I wanted to make a controller called users, I would specify FilePile to replace class name with user, and it would be changed here, it would be users, and then it would become user controller.php. And you can see the same thing kind of stands here and in my class name as well. I'm going to jump back to my root here, and you can see I'm doing the same thing with my feature tests. So I would have a users folder and then a user test. And what I want to do is I just want to grab this URL and copy it. We're going to use that in a second when we create a new file. So let me jump back to FilePile and go back to my piles list, and you can see we have our authentication tests pile. I'm going to go ahead and create a new one, and this one's just going to be, we'll call it demo crud. The slug can just be crud. Now for the default install path, I actually want to leave this blank, because you'll see since FilePile is going to be creating these folders that we already have in GitHub, it's going to be starting from the root. And this makes it very, very easy for me to add much more stuff later on. If I wanted to add views, if I wanted to add maybe a model, if I wanted to go that far into the database. So I can get very, very complex here. So I want to make sure that when FilePile is installing this, it's starting from the root, and then my GitHub repository from there would define the files that I'm adding onto this later. So I'm going to leave that blank for the post install message. Now because FilePile doesn't edit existing files, I want to make sure I make a note to myself to add this controller to the routes file, for example. Say something like link the controller to the routes file. We're all set. Create pile. Again, I just want to make sure I link that repository that I had copied. I hit save. So now if I were to run this right now, it's actually going to copy those files that I have as underscores, and it's going to keep that. So what I want to do is I want to make a new prompt to ask myself what do I want this value to be? So if I go back here, I'm going to add a prompt, and the prompt is just going to say, we'll say, what is the class name? And you might even want to specify the casing for yourself. That way you know exactly how it's going to type out, because right now there's no formatting that's involved. So if I wanted this as hyphenated class name, I would have to make a separate prompt that said, what is the hyphenated class name? And then the slug is what is the value that I want to replace. So in this case, I'm going to say class name underscore, and I think that's it. We should be good. So I hit save, and let's go ahead and test this out. So one more time, if I go back to PHP artisan FilePile list, I now have my CRUD command available, and I can run that using PHP artisan FilePile install CRUD. So what is the class name? I'm just going to say podcast, hit enter, and then it's going to tell me, hey, we're about to create these two files we have, and you can see it's already replaced the folder name, the file name for both of these, and it's going to replace the content as well once I hit continue. So do I want to continue? That looks good to me, so I'll hit yes. And it tells me it created those files. Let me just double check my directory. So now if I go to my demo project tests feature, I have a podcasts folder, podcast test. And if I open that up, it replaced that class name with podcasts. Let me just go back and go to my HTTP controller. I now have a podcasts folder and a podcast controller if there's replacements made within the file as well. So you can see you can get very complex with this, and this can be a very powerful tool